couple days ago, I did a create a quick great tone video talking about proper placement of the volume pedal in a signal chain within our Helix. Now, when I say proper, that's kind of a funny thing to state because there is not necessarily a proper place, but there's different places that are going to give us different results. And I mentioned something in that video when we were placing our volume pedal before other blocks in the chain. I mentioned how the volume pedal could affect our tone based on whether we're feeding it into a linear or non-linear block. Now that raised some questions, and I received a bunch of questions from folks, and it got me thinking that this is actually an extremely important topic. I've touched on it before in other videos, but I've never really done an in-depth video just on linear versus non-linear blocks, and a lot of folks kind of scratch their head, and they may be getting results that they don't want from their preset simply because they don't understand the difference between a linear and non-linear block. So what is the difference? Well, without getting extremely technical about it, basically a linear block is going to give you out of it what you put into it and is not going to change its behavior based on how high or low the signal is that's going into it. If we hit it with 5 dB extra, we're just going to get the same results coming out the other side. Whereas a non-linear block will change its behavior. It will add things maybe such as distortion characteristics that can be quite unpredictable, or could add compression as a compressor does. A compressor is a great example of a non-linear block. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean that if we're feeding into a reverb, what we put into it is what we're going to get out. It's obviously going to add reverb, but it's not going to be adding anything that we're not expecting. Obviously, if we put a reverb block on, we're expecting to get reverb, but we may not be expecting to get distortion characteristics. And that's not to say that we will, but maybe if we send it into a particular delay, we will get distortion characteristics, whereas with others, we won't. So why is this so important? Well, some folks might be doing things like, boosting the channel volume on a guitar amp block, knowing that, well, the channel volume doesn't affect the tone of the amp. It just gives us clean volume output of that amp. But what if that clean output volume is hitting a block later in the chain that's then reacting in a way that we're not expecting because we didn't realize that it's actually a non-linear block rather than a linear block? Maybe there's a compressor after it. And when we boost that volume up to get a little more boost in our solo, we notice that the volume doesn't actually get boosted. And maybe that's because the compressor is squashing down on it more just because it's receiving more input and the fact it's a non-linear block, if that makes any sense. So it would be really nice to know which blocks are linear, which ones are non-linear. Now, without going through every single block in the Helix, which would take far too much time, I set up a little system here within my DAW, and I'm going to explain it to you, that can kind of show what the outcome of linear versus non-linear and give us some ideas of which blocks are, which blocks aren't. But you could also set up a similar test for yourself, and you can test out the blocks that you would like to know more about and make a more informed decision as to, is this a linear block? Isn't it a linear block? And if it is not a linear block, is the difference enough to really affect my preset in a way that's going to make it something that I don't want to hear? So without further ado, let's dive over to Cubase, where I have a bit of a crazy setup here today. And I'll explain to you what I'm doing first, and then we'll look at some examples of some of the actual blocks. All right, so here we are over in Cubase. Now, you might be wondering what I have here. First and foremost, if I come down to the bottom here, what I actually have is a little project with a little guitar loop. Really annoying and ridiculous, but for this little test, we just needed some noise. So here it is. Me just chugging away on my A string. So what is happening with this is that that particular track here in the mixer, the Guitar DI, is sending that out a mono output, which is actually feeding my Helix, which we can see up here for Helix. You'll notice both paths that I have here are receiving USB 3.4, and that's what this Guitar DI is sending out to. Now, the only difference is this path up here is sending out to USB 1.2. This path is sending out to USB 3.4. Guitar 1 here is receiving USB 1.2, and Guitar 2 down here is receiving USB 3.4. So basically, I have 4 gain blocks on here. Now you'll notice that the top ones are snapshot enabled. They're still at 0. Everything's at 0 right now. So these paths are identical. But when I go to snapshot 2, these gain blocks up here are changed. I boost the first one by 12 dB and I cut the second one by minus 12 dB because I'm going to put a block in here. And what we're trying to find out is whatever blocks we put in here, are they going to react different depending on how much input they get? So set at 0 where all these are the same, whatever blocks I put in here should be identical because they're processing the sound exactly the same. But then when we switch to this, we will see how much an effect hitting the front end of this block, this phantom block that we're going to put in after, how much that extra 12 dB is going to affect the sound. Then we cut the 12 dB over here that we put into it so that we match the volumes again. Now, what that allows me to do is to use a simple null test down here. So you'll notice if I flip the phase on one of these channels, let's just try this. If I come over here and I start this loop, we hear it. Now, if I flip the phase on one of those channels, if these are identical, we won't hear anything anymore, and this stereo out will go down to 0. As you can see, we don't hear anything. It takes a couple seconds for it to fully fade away. But you'll notice here it fades down to infinity. So we know that this little guitar DI fed into both of these paths are identical. Now what happens if I flip over to the plus 12 dB setting? It should still be identical. Now we get a little blip when we switch, some little hiccup there. But then we notice that even though I'm boosting 12 dB here, subtracting that 12 dB, we're still getting the identical sound coming out of both of these paths. So that's very good to know. Now, obviously, again, when I go back, you're always going to get a little hiccup when I do the switch between snapshots. So what if we start adding blocks in here? Well, the first thing we have to do when we do add a block in here, we have to make sure that when they're all set at 0, which is identical, that we are getting a perfect null. Because within the Helix sometimes, and I've talked to some of the folks over at Line 6 about this, and we did sort out what the problem is. If you're not getting a null, a lot of effects are using any sort of oscillator to control maybe a parameter that cycles, like a modulation, or the hum and ripple on any of the guitar amp models. If we have two identical paths, but they're being processed even milliseconds of difference on the timeline of that oscillator, they're not going to match up, and they're not going to null perfectly, even though they're still identical. And I hope that makes sense. So the way around that is we simply add some blocks here, and we see if they null when they're all at the same setting. So let's do that. And I'm going to start off with one that doesn't null perfectly. So here is a couple instances of the script mod phase, which are the identical settings. Now you'll notice that even though we're playing through what did null before, these don't null anymore. And what we end up with on our stereo out here, somewhere on our meter with the peaks around minus 37.7, you might say, well, why? They're identical. And they would sound identical. But the fact that we have a low frequency oscillator working to control the phase effect, it's a modulation effect. You know, though, if those aren't perfectly in sync and in time, then they're going to not null. Now, we can take this result though, and what if we go to our plus 12 setting to see if when I hit the front of the script mod phase with more input, does it change what our result is here? So we're in and around minus 36.4. Let's do that. Now I've hit this with 12 dB more signal, as we can see right here, and I've taken out the 12 dB over here, but we're getting almost the same result basically. So there is our minus 36.4 again. So it shows that this is really going to be a linear effect, even though the null isn't working perfect. We're going to have better examples of this, but I wanted to show you this example first. So now here is even a better example. I've taken two instances of the dynamic room block, and you'll notice that these two, in fact, do null beautifully when set to 0 dB here. So this is great. We know that those null. Now, if I go to the plus 12 dB setting, let's see if sending more signal into this changes its behavior, making it nonlinear, or does it stay the same and remain linear? Now, I've changed to the plus 12 dB. We wait for our meter to fade away here, and there's no difference. So we now know this dynamic room block is also a linear block. Hitting it with more input is not going to change its behavior. Let's try a more obvious one here. Now, this one is going to be the LA Studio Comp. So we already know that a compressor is non-linear, but it still nulls out beautifully here if we're hitting it with the same input level. If I change this to plus 12, we already know what's going to happen. Now we're hitting the front of the compressor with 12 dB more. It's going to hit the threshold of that compressor and it's going to start compressing more than it was on the 0 dB setting of gain going into it. So you can see here quite a big difference. Now, even when I go back here though, the problem is this takes a lot longer to actually get back to nulling simply because the release time on that compressor is quite long. Let's try something like the transistor tape delay, one of my all-time favorites in here. Now, this one I think is going to be kind of obvious. I'm having a feeling with this is going to be nonlinear. So we can hit this with plus 12 dB. We see that it was nulled perfect before. Let's see what the result is now. And sure enough, maybe not as big a difference as we thought, but we're still getting like a minus 63 and a minus 57.7. Whereas if I go back to the 0 dB setting and let those meters fade down, we end up with a perfect null, telling us that again, the more signal we hit the transistor tape delay with, we are altering the tone in some way. Is that going to be something that's going to affect us? Well, we really don't know until we try it. If your ears are telling you everything's working still, then it's fine. I wouldn't worry too much about it. And maybe we're not even going to be hitting it with 12 dB more gain. So it may be a non-issue in this particular case. But again, just understanding this, especially with use on, let's say, compression, is a really important thing to know when creating and using and tweaking Helix presets. We could have a great Helix preset that we start playing around with and then wonder why it's not working the same way. And maybe we're missing something like this, that we're sending more or less signal into a nonlinear block. Now, while we're on the topic of delay, let's talk about a simple delay. So here we have the same thing running here. We have two simple delays with the same settings. We have a perfect null. Now let's see what, and again, I can show you, I still have the sound running. You see the other meters going here. So we do have a perfect null with the simple delay. So we found out with the transistor tape that it is nonlinear. How much signal we send into it is going to affect how it behaves. What if I pump 12 extra dB into the simple delay? After that little blip, we'll let the meters fade back down. And we have no issue here. So we know that if we are feeding more signal into something like the simple delay, it is not going to change its behavior. It's just going to give us the delay we were looking for. Now, we already looked at one reverb. Now let's look at a different reverb. Let's look at something like just the classic legacy room reverb. Here we have it perfect null again when we pump 12 dB into the front end of one of them after our little initial blip. We fade right back down. So again, the reverb blocks seem to be linear blocks that are going to behave the same way regardless of how much input signal is going into them. Now, I think one example that's going to be extremely obvious is when we use an amp block. And I've used an instance of the Matchstick channel 1 here. And you'll notice again, we get this perfect null when we flip the phase. There's the tone that is coming through with that little annoying chugging A riff. And we'll let this bleed back down here to infinity. Now, what happens when I pump 12 dB into one of these? Well, obviously, a massive difference. We're now hitting that front end of that amp with so much more signal. It's going to distort and clip, and there's the difference, right? Look at this, minus 18.7 on our output meters here. Go back to the 0. And that fades back down to infinity. So definitely, as we would well expect, an amp block that is modeling a tube amp is most certainly going to be nonlinear. Now, what about something like our Jazz Chorus model, which is a solid state amp? Well, here we see, again, perfect null when they're set at the same. But when I pump 12 dB more input level into the front of that, behaves very different than the Matchstick channel 1 did. So it's not having as big an effect as we would expect, and it breaks up in a very different way. Really interesting stuff. What about something like a simple EQ block, like a low and high shelf? Here we see on both these settings, 0 dB, we get the perfect null. And when we pump 12 dB of extra level into it, again, we get the perfect null. So that is also going to be a linear block. What about a different EQ block, something like the Cal EQ graphic? Here we have them nulling perfectly on both settings, whether hitting it with the 0 dB gain block or the plus 12. And again, we get our little blip at the beginning, but then it quickly fades down in a matter of seconds down to nulling perfectly. And lastly, I've put in an heir apparent overdrive pedal. So an overdrive pedal, as I think we would expect, would be much like an amplifier. The more signal we hit into it, the more it's going to break up and distort. So we see at the 0 dB setting, we're getting a perfect null, but if we hit the heir apparent with 12 dB more signal, which would be kind of similar to, you know, playing with a guitar with higher output pickups. We're going to hit the front end of that. Obviously, there's a difference. So again, this here would be a nonlinear block. All right, so that gives us a better picture of which blocks are linear, which ones are nonlinear. Now, how do we put this to use? Does it matter? You know, it matters and it doesn't matter, I guess. Something like the transistor tape where there was just a tiny, tiny little bit of difference when we hit the front end of it with 12 dB, extra input level. You know, if we were to just bump one of our snapshots up to get a little boost out of it, you know, by a dB or two, are we really going to notice that difference? I would probably tend to think not so much. So in that case, it's going to be up to us whether we hear a difference, but at least we're aware that there is a difference, no matter how subtle. But where could this make a bigger difference? Well, obviously we don't need to worry about basic EQ blocks, basic delays that are just kind of digital delays, reverbs. But what about compression? A lot of folks, like myself, like to put a compressor at the end of their signal chain. A lot of folks like to put it after their amp, maybe before some other effects. So we would really have to keep that in mind, that when we maybe add some sort of boost to maybe get a little more volume for a solo, let's say, and we boost it from the amp, we're going to be hitting the front of that compressor harder. It's going to compress more, and maybe we won't even notice the volume boost because the compressor is actually fighting against that. So in that case, a lot of times for a volume boost, I will go to the end of my chain, use my output block maybe, or put a gain block after my compressor and boost from there so that I'm actually getting more level, either straight to my output or into blocks that are linear that are not going to be affected tonally. So really interesting stuff. So if we are going to change volume input level, whether it's with a volume pedal, whether it's with a boost pedal, whether it's just with a gain block to add some more volume for whatever reason we need that, we have to be very mindful that whatever is downstream in the chain will be affected. If they are linear blocks and we're not driving anything into clipping anywhere, then we're going to be okay. It's really not going to affect the outcome or the sound of our tone, and we will get what we want. But if there is a block in there that is non-linear, it is going to change it. Maybe very subtly, maybe very dramatically. But if we are scratching our head ever and wondering, why is this changing so much? That would be the first place to look, and go check, I would say, first and foremost, your compressor. Also, knowing that if we are boosting level going into an amplifier, mostly the tube amp models, or into an overdrive pedal, or into a preamp model, then we are going to get potentially a very dramatic difference. But even small differences of a dB or two boosted into the front of one of these nonlinear blocks can make quite a difference and could waste a lot of our time trying to figure out why our tones are changing. So I hope that that was helpful, and I hope it answered some folks' questions concerning that matter. It can be a bit of a confusing matter. I hope I explained it all right, and I hope I explained it in a way that was understandable and that helps out. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please like the video, share it with anybody who you think would get some use out of it. I have had that question a lot, and I thought it was about time I did an in-depth video on the topic. Also, please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I will be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for sharing your time with me. Ciao for now.